Welcome back to the Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast where one of the hosts always plays to the whistle. Whistle makes him stop. Hurts his ears. That's Lenny. I'm Mina Kimes. And I'm joined for the first time ever. You guessed. Dan Pizzuta. Friend of, well, you're not a friend of the show yet. You're a friend of mine through the internet, but now you're a friend of the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I feel like I'm through the internet, a friend of the show. Listen to almost every episode. I feel like I've been here a while, but very honored to be on.
So for those who don't know Dan's work, he does a great job covering the NFL. Most recently with Sharp Football Analysis, I think sharpfootballanalysis.com. Yep. But I really love, you do a really good job identifying trends and things that teams are doing. And I've really enjoyed reading your work for a while. So I figured I should have you on. And especially this time of year, which is sort of, it's a transitional point in the NFL calendar. Minus the NFL schedule release, which is now a multi-day event. There's announcements for announcements, big changes. I'm flying to Connecticut tomorrow to reveal the schedule. But the draft's over. We've kind of taken stock of the draft. Usually what I do next, Dan, is kind of take stock of teams in the offseason. I think this year we'll probably do QB rankings again, defense rankings, that kind of thing before getting into our previews. But what I decided to do for this episode is something I haven't done in a really long time, which is a mailbag. And for me, it's a really good way to not only touch base with you, the listeners, the viewers, if you're watching this on YouTube. If not, go check it out. But also to talk about teams that I haven't really gotten around to. And that was kind of fun to me, going through some of the questions I got, picking some teams that I haven't dug into. The Vikings, for example. I feel like I haven't talked about the Vikings in forever, but they've done some interesting things this offseason. So we're going to talk about the Vikings. I sent you all the questions. Some of them are a little wacky, but a lot of them are just kind of based on teams. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm excited.
Great. Oh, what's your Twitter handle? I forgot it's not your name, right? It's something else.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it's just your name. Okay.
Yep.
DanPizzuta. Go follow him, guys. All right. Da-da-da-da. First question is from a listener who has sent in questions before. I recognize her name. It's Lisa Brzezinski at Strong Basil, who asks, which team is most likely to go from worst to first in their division? So Dan, I feel like there are two very obvious candidates. Two is identified. Did you land on two as well?
So I had them tiered. I had one in a tier by themselves.
Oh, okay. Give me the tier.
The Jets. So that was the Falcons.
The Falcons, not the Jets. Oh, wow. Okay, great.
I kind of feel like Falcons are cheating a little bit because they were only a game out. Every team in that division still finished with 7 wins. So they weren't really last place. And that entire division is just super weird. And I know we have a question about the Falcons later. So
yeah, we're going to dig really deep into the Falcons later. So.
Yeah. So I kind of feel like they were a cheap answer to this question just because of the NFC South in general. But yeah, in my next tier is the Jets.
Just the Jets.
I have the Jets and the Browns slightly below them in the same tier, and then kind of everyone else.
So I considered
there's a separation in the tier.
Yeah, I considered the Browns because I did a roster review a few weeks ago, and one of my big takeaways was the Browns roster is extremely good. However, I think for the Browns to compete, you would need the quarterback to play significantly better than he did last year. And they're also in a very, very difficult division, not unlike the Jets.
Right.
Whereas I think the Jets, and I guess maybe this is a good place we can talk about the Jets here at length, because I had the Falcons and the Jets tied. And I checked the odds just out of curiosity, and they're almost identical to win the division. The Falcons are plus 225. That's the second best odds behind the Saints. And the Jets are plus 220, right behind Buffalo. Obviously, depends what you look at. But I thought I get it. The case for the Falcons, you kind of laid it out. It really is. I mean, there's the team, which we'll get to. There's the division. Obviously, 3 teams finished 7-10 last year. I don't think anyone, you can really make a case for, maybe not the Bucks, but I don't know. that division is wide open, whereas the Jets are in a very, very difficult division, like the Browns. I think the reason I have them above the Browns is not necessarily because I think it's so much more likely that Rodgers will return to form, although I do think he's certainly going to play better than he did last year. But because, Dan, I think the Jets defense is awesome, and I think they're going to continue to be awesome. So last year they finished 5th in DVOA, 4th against the pass, 10th against the run. And I was looking at the depth chart to see what changes there were. And really, they lost Sheldon Rankins, who played well. Quan Alexander, I think, is still a free agent. But this is the defense that it was. Only they added some players. They added... Well, they drafted Will McDonald in the first round, for example. They signed Chuck Clark to help at safety. But up front, it's the same group, unless Quentin Williams decides to sit out. Oh, they also added Al Woods, who's like a very underrated nose tackle.
Yeah.
And this was a defense that was young last year. So I guess my feeling is, and perhaps this is true more than Cleveland, where it's always like the good on paper, but are they going to come together kind of defense?
Sure.
I'm having trouble thinking of a reason why this defense would regress. And then, as we all know, the offense was awful and there's nowhere to go but up.
Yeah. And I think one of the really interesting things about the defense, I think when we talk about defense a lot, it's always, it's hard to sustain a top tier defense from year to year. But when you look at what the Jets did last year, they did it without getting a ton of turnovers, right? So they were only 27th in turnovers per drive. And kind of when you look at that and a team that excels on defense without turnovers, that's usually a pretty good sign that they're going to be good again. So I looked at teams that allowed under 30 yards per drive and had a turnover rate of under 10%. And when you go back the past 10 years, it's a lot of average defenses, and 8 of the 14 in the next year were in the top 10, and 5 of them were in the top 6 by DVOA. The crazy thing this year is there were 3 teams that did that. It was New Orleans, Washington, and the Jets, and they were already in the top 10. But the Jets were already 5th in DVOA without all of those turnovers. So it's something that usually looks like it's going to be a good defense again next year. This is something that the Jets were already doing while they were a good defense. So I have a little more confidence in them to be a really good defense, even though we know that defense usually isn't as stable year to year.
That's a great point. And always when you guys are out looking for regression and improvement candidates, what Dan just cited, unsustainable turnover rates, is one of the many things that you should look at. And there is health. They were pretty healthy. So, maybe the injury bug might hit them, but they're just so deep. I mean, the players, I just in the front, I want to read you these names. So I mentioned Quentin Williams, Quentin Jefferson, Al Woods, Solomon Thomas, Jermaine Johnson, who was, a rookie and obviously has room to improve. John Franklin Myers, who was extremely good for them. Carl Lawson, who was coming back from injury last year. Bryce Huff, who they use situationally, but is really good.
Bryce Huff is really good.
He's so good.
He stands out just every time he's on the field.
They brought him back for not that much money. And then Will McDonald, who they drafted this year and who they can just use situationally as well. That is in such a stacked group of players. So, when we talk about the injury thing, I guess what jumps out is they've got depth. My biggest question would be probably, safety is not, I would say is probably, if I had to pick one kind of weakness with this team, Chuck Clark's okay. Whitehead is, I would say maybe a little bit one-dimensional, but a decent player. But fine, if you're going to pick one area to have not a ton of depth there, I'm okay with safety. Yeah, and also, guess what? This defense isn't going to have to stay on the field as much. That's another thing. I think one of the things that I think we can underestimate when we talk about football and all the things that you and I look at when we talk about these units and whether they'll be good or stuff is just how unbelievably dispiriting it is to play with a quarterback. This is the number one thing defensive players tell me is at a certain point you at the beginning of the season you have a lot of pride in it and you're the defense is carrying the team, and then at the end of the season you're all looking at Zach Wilson in the locker room and you're this is a nightmare. And I really think that that's another reason why I expect the defense to play even better is just the fact that the offense should be able to string together longer drives. and not be a totally depressing to watch every time they take the field should help them as well.
Yeah, I think so. I kind of wonder what this offense is going to look like with Rodgers, and kind of that's the big question, right? Because like last year, there were times when he was just like actively rebelling against the offense, and he's they say he's locked in now. Everyone's going, oh, he's so excited to be here. He's on the field for the OTAs and all these practices, but even though he's going to be exciting for the offense, if it's going to be his offense?
Yeah,
I'm not sure, which is a lot more, shotgun heavy. The Jets were doing some more stuff under center. 37% of Breece Hall's runs were from shotgun. So he was more under center.
Good in both, though. I looked this
he
up.
was very good in both. Yeah, like top EPA per play in both. But Rodgers was good at under center play action, but he hates it. So is there going to be a marriage of that run and pass game? Is that something that he's just going to override, which is kind of my big question for what that is actually going to look like.
Nathaniel Hackett's not going to boss him around and take control? Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's my big question with the Jets is just kind of what is the offense actually going to look like? Because the assumption that it's going to be a continuation of what we saw in Green Bay, particularly during the MVP years, I think runs into what we saw last year, what you just described, which is not inference. Aaron Rodgers said he hated all the pre-snap motion and stuff. Like, right. So, I think it raises questions like, okay, well, if you're not putting him under center, if you're not using as much motion before the snap or whatever, how are you creating deception? How are you marrying the run and pass? How are you getting some of those easier looks that we saw at times with the Packers? And I think that's where a lot of this is going to depend on, really, can Garrett Wilson take that next Devontae Adams like leap that people seem to be like assuming he'll make? Because if Aaron Rodgers is running the offense the way he likes, which is, basically being captain, standing back in the gun, just, reading defenses and letting it rip, they're really going to need those skill players to carry some of the load, and that connection is going to have to be there. And it's going to be less about scheme in some ways. So I guess, the optimist case is that all he has to do is be average because the defense is great and because they were so crap last year. The challenge is that I expect the AFC East to be very good. So it's, I have a hard time. I went back and forth. Ultimately, the Falcons are probably a better bet, to your point, because of the division, frankly. And I think I would have to really think through, too, the Bills a little bit. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about their, I kind of am just like clocking them in as the winner without like thinking about it in depth. So I'll probably get to that when we cover the division. But it's going to be a very exciting division race. And by the way, it's going to come up again. Like, there's another question where I'm going to refer back to this division. Well, this is actually a good transition to our next question, which is about Aaron Rodgers' replacement, young Jordan Love. Parker Eves asks, what do you need to see from Jordan Love next year to be convinced he should be Green Bay's long-term starter? Well, I'll start by saying they've got him locked in for pretty cheap on 2 years. So the Packers don't need, I guess actually it bears mentioning, he doesn't have to actually be that good to be the starter.
That helps a lot.
The next year. Yeah. There's not a lot of pressure on Jordan Love. So I guess, Dan, like, what would you like to see from him? So kind of to recap, we've seen very little of Jordan Love. Year one, he struggled in his first couple of starts, one of which his family was not allowed to attend, or at least from the way up in the bleachers in Kansas City. Last year, he comes in relief for Aaron Rodgers against the Philadelphia Eagles and looks fantastic. Looks a lot better in a lot of ways, I would say. Seemed to be very small sample size, but seemed to be in much better command of the offense. Was playing quickly. Seeing the field really well. So, that's all we have to go on right now. So I guess for you, what would you want to see from him in year one, assuming he's probably going to get a year two as well?
Yeah, that was kind of the thing where I feel like the baseline is just being okay. Is like, it's kind of because of that contract. Like, that contract really plays a big part in this, because they kind of avoided the two worst case scenarios with a 5th-year option, which is like the Sam Darnold, where it's a bad quarterback with the guaranteed 5th-year option. And then there's like the Daniel Jones, where he's like a fine quarterback without the 5th-year option. And you kind of have to make that decision right after. So I feel like that kind of lowers the baseline for what Jordan Love has to be in order for him to get a 2nd year, because it kind of seems like that. But yeah, like you said, I went back and watched those Philadelphia plays. And like, he is really like,
looks good.
it did look good and like so decisive and quick. 70% of his passes were under 2.5 seconds. So there was a lot of things where he was just, and it wasn't like just like schemed up stuff. It was trust, where he was allowing things to get open in the middle of the field, and he like knew something was going to break open.
The throw to Lazard there.
He was like, he looked real comfortable and empty. I mean, again, only 5 of 7, which only 7 attempts for like that entire span. But the 2 incompletions were drops, and he had a 9-yard ADOT on those throws. So like kind of pushing the ball down the field.
He had a whole shot that was dropped, if I remember correctly. That was like on the money. Yeah.
So he's doing some things, like even in that small sample, that I wasn't really ready to see him do for like what we kind of, especially what he was back in college and this. So, you know, and they're going to scheme up this offense. Like, this is now going to be the ideal version of what LaFleur wants to run, with some of this heavier play action. You know, they have Jaden Reed, who's working to be the jet guy. They have some more tight ends. I'm really excited about both tight ends that they brought in. So I think it's going to be pretty exciting. Like, even if he's not great, I think the scheme might allow them to, you know, produce a little more, and that's going to be a little more help there.
I totally agree. We played a clip of Matt LaFleur talking recently, I guess, on NFL Live yesterday, and he just looked so happy and so relieved. You know, which that's not, for me, like, setting aside whatever the personal stuff with him and Rodgers, who was obviously only a year removed from playing at an extremely high level. I think it's easy. You can certainly intuit that there was, as we talked about with Rodgers, you know, a bit of a conflict in what the offense should look like. And now he gets to basically call the shots. And I personally think Matt LaFleur is a really good play caller. I think he's really good at sequencing plays. I think he's really good at making things look like each other, using formation and personnel groupings to get matchups and mess with defenses in creative ways. So we, you know, like when we were just talking about this with the draft and all the young quarterbacks and what kind of spots are they landing in. And when I look at Jordan Love in the context of his first year, it's fine. It's pretty good. I mean, obviously he doesn't, there's no proven number 1 wide receiver. I think that's totally fair to say, although obviously some encouraging stuff from both Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs at times during the season. But while he might not have like a number 1 wide receiver, you have a dominant run game and one of the better offensive lines in football and one of the better offensive play callers in football. That's pretty damn good. I'm excited to see what he does. I think, this is a team, you talk about the 2 tight ends that was either, I think they had the second most snaps, 12 personnel of any team, probably behind Denver off the top of my head. But, they did that, and they had a pretty high success rate, even with like Robert Tonyan and Mercedes Lewis, who are both, Lewis is a blocking tight end. Now they have, in the draft, they drafted Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. Luke Musgrave was the Packers, you remember, tried to trade for Darren Waller again. I think the way they viewed Musgrave as like being a potential Waller type in terms of his athleticism, his ability to stretch the field. Didn't have a lot of production in college. But I'm really excited to see like how he uses the tight ends, because there's such different types of tight ends from the ones that they've had recently. I think they're going to have him empty a lot. You alluded to that. And if you have a quarterback in empty who's a threat to run, that just makes things so much easier. So I just don't think he's going to be playing on hard mode his first season. So he'll be set up to succeed. Now, obviously, he has to execute. But I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah. Again, like 21 passes is not a lot to be like really get carried away with, but just what he showed in those is still more than I was ready to think, because I was not really a fan of his coming out after what he did in college, some of the inaccuracies, but just even like just having some of that quick stuff and those anticipation throws, it just kind of shows there's something there.
All right. Robert Smith asks, what's more likely, the Pats move on from Mac Jones at some point this year or pick up his fifth-year option? So I figured we should just talk about Mac Jones and the situation he's in right now, because that is a topic of great concern amongst Patriots fans. The feeling that the Pats didn't do enough to improve his circumstances this offseason, coming off of a draft where the first 3 rounds they go defense after everyone projects them to take a wide receiver, offensive tackle. Very Patriots draft. I like the players they took a lot, by the way, but that's separate from this. Very Patriots draft. So just to kind of recap, at wide receiver, you're looking at pretty similar group to last year, with the exception of replacing Juju, replacing Jacoby Myers. But otherwise, it's Devontae Parker, Kendrick Bourne, who maybe now that Patricia's gone will be used because I'm sure he's not in Bill O'Brien's doghouse yet. Tyquan Thornton. And then at tight end, you got Mike Gesicki, which was a pretty big addition, and Hunter Henry, Stevenson, Ty Montgomery. Offensive line's mostly the same. Riley Reif is at right tackle, which is a little alarming. And then, of course, the big change, replacing Matt Patricia with Bill O'Brien. So I guess, we just talked about how we both believe Jordan Love is being put in a pretty good position. How do you feel about the position that Mac Jones is in this year?
Yeah, that's super interesting. Where there was just so much going on with that scheme last year, in which there wasn't a scheme. And there were reports that Mac Jones was calling people at Alabama to ask, are we doing this right? What is the right way we should be doing this?
I live for all the Mac Jones in complaining stories from last year, because it is
they were
so
amazing.
Easy to side with him.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, it was
quick game,
right? Which and the weird thing is, when you kind of look at what his play was from a clean pocket when everything was going well, it was about the same as it was in 2021. But when things started going poorly, either when he was blitzed or under pressure, that's when things just completely went off the rails. And it's kind of what you would expect for someone who never ran an offense before. Matt Patricia, there were no answers to things that went wrong, right? So they didn't understand how to, throw hot against the blitz. It's 22% of Mac Jones' pass attempts against the blitz were to go routes. And that's not what you should be doing for Mac Jones, right? So
the entire deep passing game was an abomination with New England.
Yeah,
last year,
it was insane. So that was easily the highest in the league against the blitz. The next highest was Russell Wilson at 15.6%. So it's just a complete outlier in how they tried to handle that. So you kind of hope Bill O'Brien at least has that ability to have answers when things are not going the way they're supposed to. I don't think there's going to be a huge fundamental change, because we kind of know Mac Jones did his best when it was going to be that under center play action. That's what the idea was going to be last year, until they couldn't figure out how to install it. So they went back to shotgun, no play action. And that's kind of what Bill O'Brien's going to be doing. So I don't know if it's going to be a full fundamental shift in the scheme to that extent, but at least there's going to be competency in what that scheme is doing, which I think is already a help.
Yeah, I think there'll be a little bit more cohesion in terms of attacking defenses based on weaknesses and coverages, getting mismatches, creating easier answers for Jones. You're right. It'll still probably be a lot of the under center. Well, it's interesting because there's been different iterations of Bill O'Brien too. So I'm almost reluctant to say this is what the offense is going to look like. I suspect it'll be kind of a hybrid of what we saw year one with New England. Some of the stuff Mac Jones did in college well, in terms of the spread RPO stuff, putting him in empty, attacking the middle of the field. But I think most important is just kind of the overall design of drives. I think that's what always kind of struck me about the offense last year, is it just looked totally disconnected play to play, drive to drive. You never felt like they were setting people up. So, guys, the wide receiver group was also very challenged. And so I think even though the group of skill players is largely the same, I suspect they'll be deployed better. I mean, the other thing is so O'Brien, for those who forgot, was with New England during the great two tight end era of Gronkowski and another guy. I actually think Gesicki and Henry, I mean, it's different, obviously. Neither of these guys are Gronk or whatever, but it's like that. Like the Patriots in 12 personnel are going to be pretty solid. Like that's a good group. And I suspect we'll see a lot of it.
Yeah, it probably is. Gesicki's interesting because like he's kind of the idea of him is good, but kind of when you put him in practice is like he's kind of just a slot receiver, so he's not moving around as much as like you would kind of hope that kind of build of tight end is. So I think sometimes that can make you more static than you would think a player like Gesicki could potentially be. So how creative they are with him, how much they can move him around. The fact that, Mike McDonald, one of the most like creative play callers we've seen, which is kind of like, just stay out in the slot and we'll kind of scheme around you. So I'm not totally sure but that's probably is going to be one of their better formations, even if, he's not, this version that we kind of thought he might've been coming out.
They really, like last year, could not figure out Jonnu Smith as the potential move tight end. It'll be interesting to see how he is deployed. I think, I do have concerns about the offensive line. I mentioned Reef, and I think the depth is also not great. And obviously they went through like a bunch of different iterations and shuffled guys a lot last year, which is never particularly good. But I generally believe, to actually like kind of go back to the question, that the overall like core competency and by the way, I like the Juju signing, which I've talked about, whatever, but I could see this offense being average. Like that is something, and I think the defense is gonna be awesome. So, but I could see the offense being average. So the question is, okay, well, what's good enough to keep Mac Jones, pick up the 5th-year option? Well, if you get him kind of back to how he looked his first year, which was again like a pretty average-ish offense, it's hard for me to imagine them not picking it up, honestly. Like, I don't, and that some of that is also based on their behavior. Like, there's been rumors, a lot of rumors. Oh, the Patriots are going to look at someone in the draft. Oh, they're going to, they're calling, they should call them, like, and they've just never done anything. Like, they have not made any concrete efforts to move past Jones. So I don't know why I would believe that if he got back to his first year, they wouldn't stick with him.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's so much of a different bar between like what we just said Jordan Love has to return and like what Mac Jones. I think like what does that average look like for Mac Jones? I think would probably be a big key here. And like the other interesting thing is for the Patriots is what they're set up for in like 2024, where they have the second most cap space right now. The free agents are going to be Hunter Henry, Devontae Parker, Kendrick Bourne, Mike Gesicki, Trent Brown, like all these guys that we just talked about. They're all in the last year of their contract this year. So if they did want to kind of wipe the slate clean and think about it, they have that ability.
Such an interesting team, because it's like, does Bill Belichick want to, like, what would it look? Because, I guess if he has the opportunity to like push his chips in again and try to compete, would he believe that Mac Jones is good enough? Why wouldn't he want to upgrade at quarterback if Jones doesn't take a dramatic leap?
That's my question is, at his age, would he rather try to figure it out with an average quarterback or just go down swinging, trying to get a little better
in that division, which is crazy now. Okay. Noah 253 says the Seahawks seem to still need help with the pass rush. Correct. Is there someone out there as a free agent or a trade the Seahawks should target? I think we're looking pretty solid otherwise. So the Seahawks defensive front right now assuming they stick with the 3-4, you've got Draymond Jones, who was a signing that I did like. And they actually need a nose tackle as well. It's like Brian Moan right now and no one else. So that's a sneaky need. Jaron Reed. And then pass rush wise, you've got Uchenna Nwosu, who was very good last year. I don't think he's like a number. He's like the perfect number 2 pass rusher. Boye Mafe, who they drafted last year, Darrell Taylor, drafted a few years ago, and then Derek Hall, who they drafted this year out of Auburn in the 2nd round. That is not a very strong unit. Last week, Dominique and I talked about how they decided to double down on coverage with their, not just actually the drafting of Devin Witherspoon, but also some of the moves that they've made in, free agency, bringing in Julian Love. I think we're going to see a lot of 3 safety looks out of this team, which is cool, but it's very unclear if they're going to get to the quarterback and how. They finished 28th in pass rush win rate last year. So there's an ongoing issue with them. So, okay, so starting from the point, I think we both agree that it's not the best group. The actual question was, is there anyone out there? So I'll just read all the free agents. Tell me if any of them intrigue you. And but the Seahawks don't have a lot of money. Leonard Floyd, Frank Clark, Robert Quinn, Yannick Ngakoue, Jadeveon Clowney, Marcus Golden, Melvin Ingram, Justin Houston, Carlos Dunlap. A lot of former Seahawks on that list, which kind of speaks to how bad and inconsistent their pass rushing group has been since the days of Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. So what do you think of that group?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting group, and it's probably going to be like a bunch of rotational guys that who have flashed a little bit. The name that did stand out to me a little bit, and it's probably not going to be a name that stands out to most people,
Golden?
But Marcus Golden.
Yes. Golden. That's the one.
I think Marcus Golden is one of the most underrated,
super underrated,
edge players in the league right now. So he had 20 quarterback hits last year. Over the past 3 years, he's 14th. He only had 2.5 sacks last year, but he was getting to the quarterback. He's not a guy who wins like quickly off the line. And that may be, a Seahawks problem a little bit because they didn't get a lot of quick pressure, but he's someone who will heavily pursue everything. And he will get to the quarterback and impact. Also a good run defender. He was 9th among edges in run stop win rate last year. So that helps the Seattle run defense that kind of is lacking too. So you kind of get both sides there. I think he'd be, a real interesting fit and probably a good one and kind of fits where they are in cap space and kind of the type of player they're looking for.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, he probably made, I think it was like 1 point something million last year. Not a lot of money. So in terms of just like bang for your buck, looking at production and then cross-referencing it with potential salary, he, to me, stands out on that list. I've always thought he was underrated. I thought he was super underrated in Arizona. So I've always liked him as a player. And I just, looking at the rest of the list, it really is all kind of situational guys and a lot of guys who I think over the last year, 2 years, you've seen ups and downs from. So my feeling is for a team like Seattle that's pretty pressed on cap. And also, I don't know if their history with some of these guys would make it more or less likely that they would sign him. But to me, I agree with you that Golden jumps out as the name that I would go after. It's interesting. It's a long list of vets.
There are a lot of guys still out there.
And then there's some teams like Baltimore seems to always sign one of these guys at the end of the summer, and then they'll get like 9 sacks, and everyone's confused why. That doesn't seem to work out for Seattle. They did hire a pass rush specialist recently, which I thought was interesting. I don't want to rule out the possibility that you see a leap from, Mafe, who's young, obviously, or Derek Hall, who we haven't seen at all. I did get to watch a little bit of him after the draft, and he's an interesting player. I think he has really cool traits in terms of his athleticism and his speed, but I'm not sure he'll be an impactful pass rusher day one in the NFL because he is still figuring out how to be a pass rusher. So yeah, I do think that they need some help there. Trade wise, no one, Zadarius Smith is probably still out there, but he's too expensive, I think, for Seattle. And I wouldn't go for that probably. So yeah, I don't think I'm leaving anyone out. I haven't seen any names. All right. Well, speaking of trade candidates, that brings me to the Jake Holton 12's question, which is, do you think the Bengals have done enough in defense and offensive lines to challenge Chiefs for the number 1 seed? Well, they're challenging the Chiefs already. Like they're almost beating them like last year. So, or they beat them last year. They didn't beat them. But any case, 2 separate questions: the defensive lines and the offensive lines. 2 separate answers from me. I'll just start out. I think that I am much more excited about the Bengals defensive line right now than their offensive line, because I'm very worried about what happens if they trade Jonah Williams. And so the latest on this, so Jonah Williams, for those who have forgotten, Bengals left tackle, first round draft pick. They signed Orlando Brown to play left tackle. Jonah Williams says, that's cool. Peace. I want out. I'm a left tackle. Nothing happens in the draft. He's not traded. So there's this thought, okay, well, maybe he'll be okay playing right tackle. He played some right tackle in college. But apparently this is still very much a realistic possibility that he gets traded, that he does not want to be a Cincinnati Bengal, at which point you start looking at the scary depth that we tend to look at with the Bengals at the end of the year every year now. You know the names. I don't need to bring them up. So I guess let's start there. Like, how worried are you about the offensive line if they actually do trade Jonah Williams?
I am slightly less worried than I might have been, because there was a switch that kind of flipped for Joe Burrow in the middle of the year where he was just like, I'm just not going to take sacks anymore. And kind of that was his big thing. He would kind of extend plays a little more than he probably should have and had such a high sack rate. But then kind of when the Bengals shifted to that like almost shotgun exclusive offense around like week 6 or 7, he had the highest rate of throws under 2.5 seconds, which helps protect the offensive line there. And then he had the 10th lowest sack rate from that point on. And like that was one of his big problems over the first couple of years. So I kind of think he's putting a little more on his shoulders to help out the offensive line. So I'm not quite as worried there, because I think as long as they're fine, that's probably going to be something the Bengals can win with based on how they're figuring out what the rest of the offense can do.
One concern I would have is like the other thing that people thought the Bengals would address is tight end. Yeah. So, I think a huge reason why they ended up not going to the Super Bowl was, God, am I remembering this correctly? It was Tyler Boyd got hurt, right? About halfway through the game against Kansas City. Yes, I'm almost confident that's what happened. And I think to your point about like Joe Burrow, he gets rid of the ball so quickly. Part of the reason they improved so much against particularly like split safety looks, which he struggled against earlier in the season, was Boyd and Hurst. And I think that's another thing I would be a little bit concerned about in terms of like just having like those quick outlets for, I mean, Boyd's still on the team, but like having, a tight end who's an outlet for him. I don't know who the starting tight end, they signed someone, right?
Irv Smith.
Yeah.
Which, doesn't excite you.
Yeah.
Kind of Devin Asiasi, Drew Sample. The tight end position is not great, but I think they're going to live in 11. I think I still like the kind of guys they can rotate in behind Boyd. Like Trent Taylor was doing some stuff. Trent Irwin was doing some stuff last year.
Irwin, yeah. He kind of went off, yeah.
Yeah. I like the 2 guys they ended up drafting, Charlie Jones, kind of a smaller, shifty slot guy who made a lot out of not a lot in his college offense. And then Andre Silvis, I still have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, from Princeton. He's just like a super athlete.
Not going to pretend I watched a single second of this man. Princeton. It did real well at the Senior Bowl. He's super athletic type of guy. So I think their receiver rotation is good. And when you have Chase and Higgins, who it seems like they're going to be committed to long-term, because I think if you come out and you don't trade Higgins this offseason, you've kind of committed that you're going to be signing him to an extension. And this is kind of what they're going to have to figure out, right? Because you have the extensions for the 3 main offensive guys coming up. So this is probably your last hurrah, really, with these guys on the cap hits that they have. So, and I think that goes to the defensive side of the ball too,
where I think this is like a Lou Anarumo heat check kind of season.
It is. It very much is, especially on the back end. However, I did like the guys that they drafted. I like them for Cincinnati in particular. Like when I talked about Myles Murphy, the pass rusher out of Clemson, I expressed some questions about him as like a top half of the draft guy, because at times it seemed like he would go like in the first 15. For him to fall to Cincinnati, where he can be used situationally, and pass rush packages, I think is a really, really great landing spot next to the DJ and BJ. And I think right now when I look at their edge depth, you got Hubbard, Murphy, Hendrickson, Osai. I think that's a group you feel pretty good about, frankly, going into the season, and a group that, if this defensive line is healthy, I think should improve upon what we saw last year. Quietly, like, not great numbers as a unit, as a position group rather, last year, but through scheme, and then I think some of the play of the secondary ended up being not a huge issue. But I think that that's a group that I feel better about them this year than I did last year. I do worry about safety, and we'll see what happens at corner. If right now it's still not, they drafted DJ Turner and Jordan Battle in the secondary, who are both, by the way, like, interesting players. But it's a lot. It's a lot for Anarumo. It's a lot of young players there. I mean, they signed Nick Scott, who played a lot for the Rams in the Super Bowl run, and then kind of fell out a little bit last year. Dax Hill's got to take a step. It's going to be challenging.
Yeah, it's kind of, the Lou Anarumo defense is just kind of putting guys in position to win, and they try a whole bunch of stuff to see what works. You said the overall pressure numbers weren't great, but they don't always care about pressure because they rush 3 at the highest rate in the league. That's usually a change up they're given to, give a whole bunch of different looks. When they just play like every type of coverage in the league, they're like average just straight across when you look at everything. So they're going to just be throwing a whole bunch of stuff out. And they're another team that is really interesting, looking at like what this future is going to be. Like I say, it's a Lou Anarumo heat check season, because like this is going to have to be kind of how they play defense a little bit, replacing these guys that they lost. When you talk about Von Bell and Jesse Bates, the whole safety is out. And then you look at next year, it's who's it? Chidobe Awuzie is a free agent. DJ Reader, Logan Wilson, Trey Hendrickson has no guaranteed salary after this year. So this might just kind of be what the Bengals have to do. So I'm really interested in what the defense looks like this year, because this is just kind of the path they have to go down.
Because a couple years ago is when all their free agents kind of hit. They got all these low cost signings that worked out really well, and now it's not really free agents; it's young guys in-house. It's going to be about internal development. Keeping Anarumo was probably the biggest coup of all for them. So we'll see how that looks, and we'll see what happens with Jonah Williams. Let's take a quick break, come back, and get back to these questions. Tickets to the game, merch, meals at iconic restaurants, stays at Caesar's Palace, all this can be yours when you bet with Caesar's Sportsbook. Win or lose, every bet earns reward credits, which you can redeem across the empire. Now, if you haven't started yet, register using code OMAHAFULL, and then place your first bet up to $1,250. If you win, great, keep those winnings. But if you lose, you'll get your stake back as a bonus bet. Okay, I love this question from Liam Sars. To even out the NFC and the AFC, which teams would you swap? So I'm sure this can be quantified by, win projections and whatever. The AFC is way better than the NFC right now. No dispute. So my approach to this question was to basically look at the best and worst divisions. So my feeling is take a team from the AFC East and a team from the NFC South and swap is what I chose. And then I also tried to be mindful of geography. I didn't want some team in the West Coast ending up in the East Coast or whatever. So the teams I decided on from the AFC East, I am taking the Miami Dolphins, putting them in the NFC South. Makes sense. They're Southeast. And it was hard to decide which team to take from the NFC South, but I decided to go with one of the younger teams that's like kind of on the rise, just timeline wise. So I moved the Panthers to the AFC East. I believe if that were to happen, the Dolphins would be instantly favorites to win the NFC South. And frankly, probably amongst the 3 or 4 teams favored to come out of the NFC. I mean, let's game this out. If the Dolphins were in the NFC, the situation that I've suggested, who would you put above them in the NFC?
Philly and San Francisco?
Yeah, maybe Dallas. I'd have to think about that. There's a Dallas question. We'll get to Dallas. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, probably on about the same tier as Dallas. We'll talk about Dallas, but I have a little more faith in a Miami coaching staff than I currently do for Dallas. But yeah, so I kind of did the same thing. I just tried to switch one team in each division, which was harder when it got to the South. But I switched Miami and Washington in the East, Baltimore and Chicago in the North, the Chargers and the Rams, and then Jacksonville and Carolina.
Okay.
So wow. I like really kind of mixed it up.
Okay, so wait, who are the 4 teams that you're sending to the NFC?
Miami, Baltimore, the Chargers, and Jaguars.
Now the NFC's loaded. Wait, then who went to the AFC?
Washington, Chicago, the Rams, and Carolina.
Ooh, yeah, that would really... With your rebalancing, I actually think I'd have to look at all the teams in some, but the NFC might be better than the AFC if you did all of those changes. It would probably take 2 teams. We'd probably have to split the difference to really make it more even.
Right.
I think 2 teams would probably do the trick if they were both really good teams. So if you moved Miami and Baltimore to the NFC, I think that would probably...
Which is probably where I should have stopped because I took way too long thinking about how the other 2 divisions would switch. But yeah, I think it kind of it shakes up the middle tier at least, I think, in the AFC. So...
Yeah. I mean, I think Baltimore, I would basically... I think I view Baltimore and Miami as being in pretty similar tiers if I tier the AFC. So I think if I moved them both to the NFC, it would have the effect of what you just described, which is, or what you described when I asked you about the Dolphins, which is I still think you'd have the Eagles and the Niners probably. I can't believe I'm freaking putting the Niners in tier 1 with question mark at quarterback.
Who knows?
And then I would put the Ravens and the Dolphins in that second tier. Potentially, I might move the Niners into that tier as well. I'm putting the Niners. I can't put the Niners in the same tier as Philadelphia if I don't know who's playing quarterback week 1. It's disgusting. But yeah, I think that would do the trick. The AFC. I mean, when the Rodgers trade happened, I think I was like, oh, the AFC East is going to be a bloodbath, and people correctly were like, well, you said that about the AFC West last year. And which is correct.
True,
I mean, I thought the AFC West would be awesome. So it's entirely possible that the AFC East is not as good as we think. And it's also, I don't think anyone puts New England in one of those top 2 tiers. So it's not, I think, with the AFC West last year, the thought was that the Raiders would be better too. But Bills, Jets, Dolphins is... I actually still haven't decided how I'm going to end up ordering them, power ranking them or whatever. Try to avoid it as long as I can.
Yeah, we got some time, but it's a fun top 3 in that division. Probably potentially the most fun the AFC East has been in a while.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
It's good. Okay. Let's talk about the Falcons. Corbin Miles, Core 5 Bin asks, what do you think of the Falcons offseason and potential this year? So I've been talking about the Falcons with the draft, which is very different from talking about the Falcons season and what's going to happen.
Yep.
I do think, however, it is worth taking a minute. So I was looking at the Falcons depth chart too before to think about this question, to look at who they added and think about how good they might be. And it's funny that we were just talking about the Niners, because effectively what the Niners did was they went all in on a quarterback, and they're like, no. Turns out our massive edge is just having this like group of, monsters at skill player where we can create mismatches and dominate every team in the NFL. It doesn't really matter who the quarterback is. We just need like a point shoot guy with like a little bit of spice to him and Purdy. And that's how you end up with them choosing, Purdy over Lance, which is what they've basically done. Falcons are kind of doing the same thing. So now in 3 consecutive drafts, they've gone Pitts at 4, London at, it was 11 or 10, or I think 11, right? Or
something like that.
Yeah. And then Bijan now at 8. They are taking the top skill players every year. They are effectively, and that doesn't mean they don't believe in Desmond Ridder. I don't know what they actually think of him internally. We can talk about that because obviously it's pertinent to this question. But essentially, kind of similar to San Francisco, they're saying, okay, you guys are all out there looking for Anthony Richardson and your mutant quarterbacks who are going to elevate the offense. We're going to zig and try to elevate everything else around the quarterback. It's an interesting strategy, Dan. Like when you really kind of step back and look at everything they've done the last few years, it's kind of like in 3 of those drafts, they said, we are not going to take quarterback in the first round. And they had the option to do so in every single one of them.
Yeah. And I feel like we're talking about this strategy differently if Mariota was able to like hit some open receivers last year, because like this should have already worked. Right.
Kind of did a little bit too.
It did. Yeah. They were already like a decent enough. There was enough like football nerd writers, and I believe I was one of them, who were like, the Falcons are doing some really cool things. It's during points of last season. And they were getting open. There should have been big plays. I know the fantasy community is out on like Kyle Pitts, but like he was getting open. He was getting targets. So there were 152 wide receivers and tight ends with at least 200 routes run. Among them, Kyle Pitts was second in an inaccurate target percentage. Olamide Zaccheaus was 8th, and Drake London was 18th. So they had 3 top 20 guys in inaccurate target percentage. So like these guys were open. There were big plays that should have been there that just weren't hit. And I think we're having a much different conversation about the potential of this Falcons offense if some of those plays were already there. And like I still think they're going to be on the table for Ridder.
So and I think that's to bring it back to the question, which is like, how good are they going to be? Like, Ridder doesn't have to be great.
Yeah.
He just has to hit open dudes, And I think they're going to lean into his dual threat ability. I thought he did look decent at the end of the year in relief, in the 4 games that he played, especially as the year went along. But I just keep going back to it's not the Niners. I'm not saying Drake London and Pitts and and Bijan and Jonnu they brought in. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but it's about as similar as an approach as you're going to see in the NFL to a coach who, by the way, Arthur Smith, obviously very shared DNA. Look how she had. Says, I'm building this mech suit and I just need a guy to sit in and pull the levers. And I don't hate that strategy offensively, especially if they clearly didn't love the quarterback. They didn't love Justin Fields. They never had a shot at Lawrence, for example. So that's optimistic. I am still dubious about this defense. They did make a lot of additions in free agency, Jesse Bates, safety, Onyemata, Calais Campbell, Bud Dupree, Caden Ellis. They signed Mike Hughes, which I totally missed. Just a signing I like. Trade for Jeff Okudah. I don't think I'm missing any of the big ones. No. And they bring in a new defensive coordinator, Ryan Nielsen from New Orleans, which I think is a good hire, or sounds like a good hire based on what we saw from the New Orleans defensive line. Right. So I think they're going to be better, especially because of just, there's a lot of competent veterans. But we are talking about a defense that last year finished 26th in pass rush win rate, 32nd in pressure rate, 32nd in sack. I mean, you just, whatever, choose your metric. They sucked at getting after the quarterback. And when I look at the pass rush, I'm like, Is it good enough to win the NFC South with a good offense? Probably. But beyond that, I don't know if I believe this defense is going to be good enough.
Yeah, and that's the thing that stands out. This pass rush is not great. I mean, they signed Bud Dupree was their like big signing there, and that doesn't really do much for me. Arnold Ebiketie was, I think, has some flashes and like could develop into like a decent pass rush guy, but there's just not a lot more there. And what you said, like there is a lot of competency elsewhere on the defense, but like that still is quite a hole. But I think one of the things, I think it was I saw an interview with Cam Jordan who was talking about Ryan Nielsen. He was like, even if they don't have pass rushers, like he'll figure out a way to create some pressure, which I think is one of the, and like Caden Ellis, who comes over as the linebacker, he rushed the passer on 30% of his pass snaps last year. So like there's, some ways they can manufacture some pressure in that way, even if they don't have great edge rushers. And then, you have Grady Jarrett, who's, Grady Jarrett, Calais Campbell, adding Calais Campbell to this line is a lot of fun. So I think you might have some more interior pressure than they definitely did last year, which could probably also help kind of cover up what they're lacking on the edge.
Yeah, like Onyemata, Jarrett, Campbell, obviously all on the back nine of their careers. Also good players, though. Yeah. They're also good players.
And that's the Falcons did not have that last year.
No.
Like that is a complete 180.
Great Jarrett must be looking around like, thank God, I'm no longer sustained. Like there were Falcons defensive linemen over the last 3 years where I just didn't know who. I would just be watching and being like, I didn't know that man was on this team. Credit to the Falcons, by the way, for like completely rebuilding their offensive line, which is suddenly like a strength, particularly in run blocking, of course. And then they drafted the kid out of Syracuse this year, but like they stunk just like 3 years ago. It was a horrible unit, and now suddenly it looks like a pretty good group, which is again one of the reasons why I think Ritter will be fine, as long as whether he's going to elevate the offense, I don't know. I think that's the big question mark, and I think that could end up being the difference whether they actually win the division, they actually have potential to make some noise in the playoffs, and it's an open question. So to answer your question, I think the offseason, they're going to be better. There are things I liked. The Bijan pick is a totally, we talked about that at length in terms of when you look at that, you're looking at a longer term view, but in the short term, obviously it's going to be sick. Okay. So I promised Vikings fans that we would talk about the Vikings. Let's bounce there. I got a couple of Vikings questions. I'm kind of going to put them together. Soulful9, I think her name's Christine, says, if you're Minnesota, what do you do about the QB situation, next year's draft, extend Cousins, trade, and Meshki ATC says, can you touch on the Vikings offseason? Started to look like we're going to score 50 and throw it over the yard and hopefully don't let you score 55 type of model. So I kind of think these things are actually a little related to, but let's start with the offseason and then kind of get to Cousins, because I kind of think it flows from that. I think really what you're looking at here in terms of like what he's suggesting, which is, the Vikings, they're going to be very offensively focused, is, well, it starts with the draft, which is, I think a lot of folks expected the Vikings to go corner in the draft, and they drafted Jordan Addison, who's a wide receiver. And, I think cornerback remains a question mark on this team that we can get to. I think that the offense, we'll see what happens to Dalvin Cook, who remains a trade candidate, although it was hard for me to find a trade partner, frankly.
Right.
I think the offense is going to be good. I'll start there. The Addison pick on its own, separate from whether or not they should have taken a corner. I know, I was higher on him than some. I understand the questions about his size, but I really just think he has elite separation skills. I really like his route running. And most importantly, he joins a Vikings offense that last year had one receiver, Justin Jefferson, who ranked 5th in yards per route run, which we like to look at, assuming you as well. So look at wide receiver productivity and usage.
Yep.
And not another wide receiver in the top 100. Not another one. TJ Hawkinson, who joined the team midseason, ended up at 51st. So, Justin Jefferson, all those games where he was doubled and bracketed, and they weren't worried about Adam Thielen separating, or KJ Osborne is a useful player, but things are going to be so different for him with the presence of another wide receiver who can threaten at all 3 levels, really. And I think the Vikings and Kevin O'Connell, that offense is a really good landing place for Addison in terms of playing to his strengths, finding ways to hide his weaknesses. He won't have to beat press as much in this offense, which is so condensed, and they can hide him, using the formation. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if this passing game looks way better than it did last year. And I think in doing so, it's going to be an easier time for whoever is running the football.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on Addison. When I loved him as a prospect, he's just like that. Even back, watching Kenny Pickett for last year's draft, my main takeaway was, oh, Jordan Addison's really good. And so he had more than 3 yards per route run in 2 different offenses in back-to-back years. So he's a guy who wins, and he just understands how to play receiver. So obviously there are the size issues, and he didn't have the greatest straight line speed, but he's just a guy who knows how to get open. And then, like you said, there was a fundamental shift in what the Vikings were able to do on offense when TJ Hawkinson came over.
Yeah.
Because before that, they had absolutely no secondary threat. And Justin Jefferson was kind of playing that shallow, I have to bail Kirk Cousins out here type of role. And then TJ Hawkinson came over, and Justin Jefferson was allowed to then be Justin Jefferson as TJ Hawkinson took over more of the middle of the field stuff. Kirk Cousins' ADOT shot way up. Justin Jefferson's ADOT shot way up. He was playing an empty a little more. He went only 4.4% of Kirk Cousins' throws were over 20 air yards before Hawkinson. That went up to 12.8% post Hawkinson. And now you add Jordan Addison to that, who is a legitimate second wide receiver. So you are going to have 3 actual passing threats. And I think Kevin O'Connell did a really good job of scheming some things open, especially toward the end of the year. I'm really excited to see what that offense is going to be. And then, like you said, I think that's going to help the run game, because they lived in 11 personnel, but no one really cared. So they still didn't have a lot of light boxes. Even when they were trying to run from 11, and they were terrible at running from 11. They had the highest rate of runs that went for 0 or negative yards when they were running from 11. And it's just once you open that up a little bit, I think that's going to help everything. That's going to connect some of the offense too. So I am really excited for what this offense can potentially be.
I expect him to also use Jefferson, or both Jefferson, but I was going to say Addison. When they're in 11 personnel, it's not a 1-for-1 with the Rams offense in terms of Jordan Addison is not Robert Woods or Cooper Kupp, but I think they can. There will be a lot of pre-snap motion, and I think that's also going to help the run game too. Just in terms of moving second level defenders around and creating uncertainty. So yeah, I'm excited about the offense. The defense, I don't know, man. You're basically counting on the guys you drafted last year to be good. Yeah. Their big signing was Marcus Davenport, who, if he's healthy, I think should help with the pass rush. God knows what the deal is with Zadarius Smith right now. I think he still wants out. But the secondary, so the other big signing was Byron Murphy. They did bring in, obviously, I do think Brian Flores as defensive coordinator will help a lot, especially, given how passive the scheme was. Yep. And I and every other person on earth just tore their hair out watching it at Donatel's defense. But I also questioned whether he has the horses back there. So you need Lewis Seam Jr., the safety, barely played. Andrew Booth Jr., cornerback, barely played. Both drafted early last season. I would say at least one of them needs to be a good player for me to feel okay about this defense, because the secondary otherwise is a big question mark.
Yeah, I think that's the key. The development of that 2022 class is if they hit on some of those guys, then the defense can probably be okay. I was a big fan of Lewisine coming out.
Yeah.
The one like true deep safety in that class, which I think could help in a Brian Flores type of defense. So it seems like he's going to be back on track and kind of ready to go for some off-season workouts. So I'm still excited about what he can do. But yeah, like you said, both him and Booth were hurt. Brian Asamoah, who they drafted in the third round, he only played like 10% of the defensive snaps, but it's probably going to be in a bigger role this year. So if those guys can develop a little bit, then I think you're starting to get maybe something, but you're right. It's a lot of unknowns right now. But again, like this defense can maybe be average and just not give up as many big plays as they did last year too. And I think that's probably a big key also.
And I think the big question is, okay, so this is the Vikings are a team that we now all accept got very lucky last year and is obviously a regression candidate. However, can they improve enough on offense to save that off? Can the defense, being even just average, make a mark there? I think that's it's a reasonable possibility that I don't think they're going to be one of the better teams in the NFL or anything like that. But in terms of like winning the division and competing in a lesser NFC, I think those two things would have to happen. And then if those things happen, we get to this interesting place with Kirk Cousins, which brings me back to the Cousins extension question. Everything the Vikings have done suggests that they are ready to move on from Cousins in terms of how they've approached his contract, which they finally can move on. However, you and I both think the offense can be pretty good. Yeah, I mean, not like, amazing, but, I'm optimistic. So I don't know what the front office will do if he has a good season, frankly, because they could end up in like that no man's land where they're not in position to draft one of the two studs next year in the draft. You never know who's available these days. But realistically, will they be able to upgrade from Cousins next offseason? I question that. However, he will probably command a lot of money if he plays well.
Yeah, I feel like that's a risk they're willing to take at this point, to wait and see. Like the Cousins thing was interesting, and he did play better, efficiency wise, like once that Hawkinson trade happened. But it was kind of, when you look at like EPA or DVOA, it was his worst year. Usually like the Vikings offense is kind of fine, and like Cousins looks great by like DVOA or EPA, but it was the complete opposite last year, where the Vikings were winning every game and it was his worst by efficiency. But he was also like doing some good stuff. You kind of like watched him, there were some better processing and things. So I think you're right, they made it clear by not extending him this year that they want to leave their options open, right? He only has a $20 million cap hit this year, but $28 million in dead cap next year because of the void years that they have on the deal. So it's a thing where they could have figured something out to maybe lessen that a little bit, but it kind of seems like they're just going to be a wait and see type thing. We'll see how he plays. We'll see maybe who be available. I know like Trey Lance was a rumored trade piece, but I don't understand that at this point, because then you kind of get to the Jordan Love situation where he's not going to play until his fourth year.
Right.
And you have to make a fifth-year option decision before he even plays. So I don't think that makes a lot of sense, even though I'd love to see that version of the Vikings offense. But I think it's a wait and see, I think is kind of fine, because I don't think Cousins, even if he does play well, is not going to get like a top of the market deal, because he's going to be 35 this year. So I don't think it's going to, maybe I shouldn't be talking about Kirk Cousins' money, because it's always more than we kind of expect it's going to be.
Would you pay Kirk Cousins more than Daniel Jones?
Well, would I pay Kirk Cousins more than I would have paid Daniel Jones, or would I pay Kirk Cousins more than Daniel Jones got? Maybe probably around there. I don't know. It is a tough place where the Vikings are, and they might kind of be in that no man's land where they might have to work those trade options. And I wouldn't be surprised if they do, or maybe they are aggressive in a trade up, even if they are, in the back half of the first round, because it kind of feels like the Vikings are one of those teams that, Kwesi is an analytically minded general manager. So that is we're going to trade back, but he hasn't been afraid to trade up and kind of use some of that to move around the draft board a little bit if there's someone. And we all know trading up can be worth it if it's a quarterback. So
next year it's just going to be such a feeding frenzy for those. I don't know. It'll be tricky, but maybe. I mean, there's always quarterbacks you don't predict who shake loose. So we'll see, including young ones. So, yeah, I think the most, it feels like the most likely situation is the most difficult one, which is Kirk Cousins finishes like 12th in most metrics and the offense looks pretty good and they're picking like 19th or something. I don't know, whatever. And then it's just like, what do you do? All right. People who will not be picking 19th, Los Angeles Rams. K-Pick 16. Huge Rams fan here. I've been arguing with friends that we should tear it down and tank for Caleb Williams. Well, you're right. They're tanking. What could we get for Aaron Donald and Cooper Kupp? Okay. And potential landing spots. So this is unfortunately where things get tricky because the Rams roster right now is basically Matthew Stafford, Aaron Donald, and Cooper Kupp. And that's it.
And that's it.
No, there's some other okay players, but I'm just saying like that. Those are it's they have cleaned that thing out, which is good because you want Caleb Williams or Drake May. However, these are difficult contracts to move. Starting with Donald, I just looked it up on Spotrac before we got started. So this year, if they traded him. And probably that ship has obviously sailed where we are in the season anyways, right. But it would have been $41 million in dead money. Yeah, just all the, you got $32 million in signing bonuses and $9 million in restructuring bonuses hitting the cap. Unless I did something wrong. I don't know if you ran the same numbers, but, and then next year that drops below 30 million. But like, I don't know what Aaron Donald's status will be next year, frankly. There was always like rumors he was going to retire anyways. I don't know. Like a lot of this would depend on Donald. Like, does he want to play for another contender? Does he care? Like, maybe he would facilitate it in some way. I don't know. Kupp this year, I came up with 22, unless I'm missing something, 22.6. Next year drops to a little bit more manageable, 16.6. But again, these things you can always do pre and post June, and there's kind of comes down to the player. I mean, do either of those two players jump out to you as potential? Like, is it something that the Rams should consider or try to make happen?
I don't know. I feel like if it was something the Rams were going to consider, it would have happened.
Yeah.
By now. The Kupp thing is interesting because he's still a really good receiver. It still has 4 years and almost $80 million left on his contract. I think 40 million of that is guaranteed. And then $5 million of his 2025 roster bonus is guaranteed in 2024, which is when there's still guaranteed money left on his deal. So he would be on the deal. So there's still a significant amount of money there, although it is manageable. If we're looking for options like Cooper Kupp, playing the Cooper Kupp role like on the Falcons is a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, that'd be sick.
Yeah. So
yeah, I get. Well, from the Rams' perspective though, like if you are going for Caleb or whatever, I actually think you might want to just keep Cooper Kupp. Yeah, I'll throw that out there as well. I think he's still going to be good. I think Donald's a different story because of where he is in his career, which isn't to say he's not going to be good, but I kind of think the interesting one is one questioner didn't mention, which is what are you going to do about Matthew Stafford? So Matthew Stafford this year, I was wondering why there weren't any rumors of a Matthew Stafford trade this year personally, because once it became clear that the Rams were not trying to win this year, I thought, well, might as well get rid of him. But it would have been over $70 million cap hit pre-June 1st this year. Next year, that drops still pretty hefty. I know these days we're like, whatever, $40 million, Aaron Rodgers, just, we'll eat that. The Cardinals will eat Kyler, whatever. Well, but if we talk about the Cardinals doing this with Kyler, who's much younger than Stafford, one would think that if the Rams were in a position to take Williams or May, that they would explore it. I guess my question would be, though, just the size of the cap hit, how possible it is. And also just can Stafford, would you, if you were an NFL team, would you be interested in it?
I'd have to be a very specific team.
Yeah.
I would think. If I was, they don't have the money to do it, but if I was Tampa,
yeah,
that would make sense to me.
Team that needs
just because they've kept everything else together. They are kind of a version of the Rams, but without a quarterback.
Tampa feel too.
Yeah, a little bit. So that would make sense. But again, just monetarily, I don't think it makes sense for really any side. And I was a pro Stafford trade when it happened initially, but right now in that version, it's tough. The Rams are in such a weird spot. Because I was a proponent of what they were doing in the way I thought the F them picks was a very misunderstood type of way to build around. And when you had Ramsey and Donald, it was easier to bring in some guys in the later rounds of the draft where they had a lot of draft picks, right? They weren't just foregoing the draft. They had a lot of draft picks and they were able to plug in some guys there. Now you look at that defense. So we did before the draft kind of went through the depth chart of every team and just kind of wrote up what was going on. And I took the defense for just about every team. The Rams were the saddest thing that I had to go through and write up. There's just nothing on that defense. So you could think maybe that offense with Stafford and Kupp can maybe pull something out with Sean McVay, but it's hard to see how that defense is going to be any good at all.
Yeah.
Kobe Durant is a really fun slot player that I kind of found in the process. Other than that, and it's just, it is a tough look.
It's in some ways it's the Cardinals is cleaner with Kyler's injury, although next year they're going to have a similar decision to make as the Rams, only with a younger quarterback. I guess if you're the Rams, your best case scenario is that Stafford comes back and looks healthy, and then you can trade him. Because even if his hit next year, I think it was 55, you could spread it out. I don't know. It'd probably be challenging. Or maybe you just keep him on for one more year with the rookie quarterback, depending on who it is, if you're in that position. But who knows? They might not even be in that position. Maybe they're picking third and they take Marvin Harrison Jr. Yeah. So, and maybe they just continue riding with Stafford. In either case, they clearly want to be, maybe it's not Williams. Maybe they're in a position just to be at the top of the draft without taking a quarterback. So it's going to be an interesting, both the Rams and the Cardinals, fascinating. All right. Last big team question. I don't think the Cowboys improved. They just replaced in free agency. Your thoughts? This is from Dennis Harabed 1. Okay.
This is a loaded question.
Yeah, I actually had to think about this a little bit because I've talked about how I really liked the Cowboys adding both Brandon Cooks and Stephon Gilmore. I really loved those signings. I think in the draft, they made some good choices. This team I think has kind of earned the benefit of the doubt when it comes to drafting. They take Mozzie Smith top of the draft, clearly trying to shore up the run defense. An unsexy but understandable pick. I guess my thing with the Cowboys is, well, let's start on offense. You're going from, so you lost Dalton Schultz and Noah Brown. You add Brandon Cooks, and then you draft Schoonmaker. Offensive line's mostly the same. You lose Zeke Elliott, maybe he'll come back. Are they better? Are they worse?
I think either way, a full year of Dak is going to help. So I think that's going to cover up anything that might be an issue, which hopefully like you're not going to get a couple game stretch of Cooper Rush, which is always going to be good news if you're looking to potentially do something better than last year. And I think they are better in a sense, because I think Brandon Cooks is a pretty significant addition. And like I wrote up like every free agent signing and trade that happened this offseason, and Brandon Cooks on the Cowboys was like, it's a thing I continually forget until like I see it on the depth chart. And then I'm reminded like that works because there was really no juice, and there was a problem with a lot of offenses across the league, but there really wasn't anyone on that offense who was opening some things up, and there was not a lot of anything that could really push the ball down the field or even just open things up for everybody else underneath. And I think Cooks can still do that, even if, he's not, Brandon Cooks of, what he was a couple of years ago. So I think that helps. So I came away with cautiously optimistic. So, you have the Mike McCarthy thing.
That. Yeah, I was just about to say that. You lost Kellen Moore, though. You bring in Mike McCarthy's going to be the offensive coordinator. That feels like, Brandon Cook's good. Play caller.
Yeah, and that's my concern. I know there's that quote going around that, Kellen Moore wanted to light up the scoreboard and I wanted to run the ball to give my defense rest. I've learned to, I'm not going to trust anything Mike McCarthy says, possibly ever, until he kind of shows it on the field. So I'm not going to believe Mike McCarthy runs the ball until like they actually run the ball, because they haven't really shown us that they're going to do it, right? They lost Zeke, and now you have Tony Pollard coming back off the injury.
Good point.
And you only added Deuce Vaughn, who's a fun player, but like that doesn't scream, we're going to run the ball 30 times.
What are you showing us? Yeah, with your personnel decisions. That's a really good point. They didn't go offensive line.
Yeah, I still have concerns about what the passing structure is going to be, right? Because we're going away from some of like Kellen Moore just like threw some stuff out there. Like there was an entire drive last year where they went in 0-3 personnel and just had 2 running backs and 3 tight ends and went that for a whole drive and just mixed some things up. So Kellen Moore like did some fun stuff. It didn't always work, but he was mixing it up. And I think Mike McCarthy is going to like want to run screens and slant flat, which I'm not totally sure how much of an offensive improvement that's going to be. So that's my hesitation on offense. They have the players to do well if they want to. I'm just not totally sure what that structure is going to be.
I think the defense actually could be better. So that's where I think I start. I disagreed with OP because I did love the Gilmore addition. I talked about the Mozzie draft pick, and they didn't really lose anyone. I mean, in fact, Barr and Brown are both free. The Anthonys are both free agents, I think. I don't think they've been signed. But when you look at, and they also drafted DeMarvion Overshawn at linebacker. When you look at the secondary depth in particular, not only were they incredibly banged up last year, but in that period when a lot of these corners were banged and safeties, well, when they had injuries, they had a lot of young players step up in that secondary. The young safeties, Deron Bland at corner. So I think now you've got Gilmore, who's ostensibly going to be, the other opposite cornerback from Diggs, but behind those guys and in the slot, and there's a bunch of guys who can kind of play multiple positions. I feel really good about this group. So yeah, coupled with like potentially improved run defense, Micah Parsons, year 3, full-time edge rusher. I think this will it's funny because last year the Cowboys were like the regression candidate. You talked at the beginning about, being overly dependent on turnovers, and there were like a bunch of reasons why it felt like it was, and then they weren't. They were awesome. They were really good again. I think Trevon Diggs became a better quarterback last year. And so now when I look at them, I don't think they're a regression candidate at all. In fact, I think that they will probably still be one of the better defenses in the NFL.
Yeah, I trust Dan Quinn so much. And that was signing originally. I was kind of, didn't No, because he, came from the Seattle structure and it was so set in what his defense was. But we've kind of seen like that's just not the case anymore. And he'll be throwing all kinds of stuff out. And like you said, even with some of those young defensive backs, they were running dime at the fourth highest rate in the league last year. And then they were running ton of cover 2 from dime. So they were like just mixing and matching a whole bunch of stuff. And then you had all the stunts they were running up front, which helped. Like you said, having Parsons as a full-time edge rusher, and he was already rushing 89% of the time anyway. But I think that is going to help. Like you said, Trevon Diggs did not have as many splash plays, but I think was more consistent. It was much less boom or bust, and it was just okay, which is, I think that's what you kind of want in the way they played defense last year. So I think that can improve. And like I said, they didn't really have a second corner last year. And to have Gilmore at that, I think that changes the entire dynamic of that defense. And keeping Lou Adarumo was big for the Bengals. Keeping Dan Quinn and him deciding he didn't want a head coaching job for them. Yeah, I think this is the perfect spot for him with these types of players. The way he's adjusted and shifted some things around. I have I think more trust than almost any defensive coordinator right now for Dan Quinn to figure out how to make a good defense out of what Dallas has.
Cowboys are good. They're good on paper. I think my only questions are depth. I would look at the offensive line in particular, maybe a couple other position groups, and then the coaching thing with McCarthy. I think we're going to kind of just need to see that play out, and see what it looks like. But I'm high on the Cowboys, so yeah. Okay, well, speaking of coaching, let's end with this question because we're going a little bit long. So the DC 19583 asks, what coaches will be in the hot seat next year? I'm gonna hang up and listen. So the way I interpret his question was just who's on the hot seat this year. Is that how you guys who? So I wasn't trying to predict who I think is going to be bad. I was kind of who comes into this season having to prove.
Yeah, I was a little in between. There's kind of a mix in between. Okay. So I think we're on the same page. So
here's the list of guys. These are not guys I'm saying that I am necessarily think that they should be fired or whatever. These are just the names where I think they got to have good seasons and potentially different teams, different standards, but playoff runs. Okay. NFC South, both Bowles and Dennis Allen.
Yep, top of my list.
Both should have been on the hot seat last year. Ron Rivera, I put, although the fact that that maybe no quarterback will save him. But yeah, I mean, it's been a few years. I feel like the no quarterback thing was a decision with them. Yeah.
New ownership.
Kevin Stefanski.
Yep. We're 4 for 4 in the same listing, also in the order.
Brandon Staley.
Yep.
He was on the, hung on last year. I think it's good that he did. I talked about it, but they gotta win a playoff game this year. And then my last one was, and maybe this might be a little surprising, Robert Saleh.
Yeah,
they got to make it work. If it doesn't work, if they do not, this is an interesting one where I think the playoff win versus playoffs will be an interesting distinction, but it's got to look and feel good because that is, they have tied their fates to this Rodgers thing. So did you have any coaches that I did not?
So I had Mike McCarthy.
Oh yeah, I should have put him on. Yeah.
In a tier kind of below, just because of
no, that's a good
when
one.
You power struggle your way to the play caller, and if it doesn't work, it probably. So I don't know if he will be on the hot seat, but it feels like there's just always going to be a conversation around Zach Taylor because it's just always kind of could they be doing better? And there was a shift where I think he was much better last year than he was kind of in the first couple years, where he was just it was fine, but they weren't really winning on offensive structure. It wasn't so much. And again, he's 10th on my list right
I think
now,
he's more likely to get a big ass extension.
Sure. And probably.
But you're doing should, not will. Yeah.
So I just kind of think there's probably going to be a section of Twitter that is kind of wondering if the Bengals could be doing a little more. But I think there was the back half of last season definitely helped his case. And I think there was a lot more offensively that he did to adjust. And that was kind of the big thing. There was never really an adjustment to some things when they were struggling a little bit. But when they were starting to get in that shotgun exclusive offense, they figured out how to beat too high, and it was well designed. So I'm not saying that it's definitely going to happen. Cincinnati's probably still one of the better teams in the league. I just kind of feel like he's one of those guys that's just kind of something that always feels like there might be a little more to what the Bengals could do. Is kind of what and then I had just Josh McDaniels, which it just kind of seems like players don't really like him.
He should be. That's the one I just
my
was
question
like,
in my notes here is, can the Raiders literally afford to fire another coach? Which I don't know.
Here's why Josh McDaniels should be on the hot seat, because the Raiders' entire offseason was basically betting on Josh McDaniels. Yep. I mean, it's kind of, we talked about this yesterday. It was, when you look at all the decisions they made offensively, they didn't get more talented at really anywhere, but they got players who were better fits for Josh McDaniels' offense. They got a quarterback in Jimmy Garoppolo who's going to run that, he's going to point and shoot and run that thing on time the way McDaniels wants, the way Derek Carr did not. They got a tight end. By the way, I love this pick, Mike Mayer. I was a huge fan of, who's that traditional inline blocker, going to run option routes, do what Darren Waller did not do for McDaniels. Darren Waller, the more, athletic player. They bring in another slot receiver in Jacoby Myers. Like, all of this is like a big bet on a head coach who was really bad last year. And so I think there should be an immense amount of pressure on the, even though the offense by most people's estimations didn't get more, like didn't add like a bunch of, I like a lot of these players, but I'm just saying, because of the strategy, he should absolutely be the one who is accountable for its success or failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just, and with all of the, the NFLPA stuff that came out, and it kind of seems like it's not a great situation. So if that goes south, I kind of feel like you're right.
If it looks good, we'll give him credit, by the way. Yeah. Like if it looks better, and I think it's totally plausible that it does. I think he's been a good play caller at various points. Then you'll feel better about it. But if it doesn't, and anyways, sorry. I'm glad you mentioned Josh McDaniels. I left him out. That's a good one. I should have mentioned him. I just was like, they can't afford it, and I kind of threw it off my list. All right, Dan Pizzuta, thank you so much for joining the show. You guys got to go follow him, at Dan Pizzuta. Check us out on YouTube. If you're not watching the podcasts, you can watch it there. And thank you so much for coming back. I hope you join us again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate you having me on.